Before we actually get into showing you how I-Corps handles an interpretation report, I'd like to provide you with some background information on the interpretation report. I feel it's extremely important because we find, and studies done by the payers, etc., have find that 80% of both optometrists and ophthalmologists are either not doing an interpretational report or not doing a proper interpretational report. If you do not do an interpretation report, or even if it's not compliant, you will get hit during an audit. Sometimes that comes in simply as a request for records, but what the end result is, the procedure itself is indicated in the LCD that it requires an interpretation report. In fact, you are not actually permitted to bill for that procedure until the interpretation report is completed. So you have to make sure you're doing them properly. We're going to get into what the characteristics and requirements of that interpretation report are in a second, but it is extremely important that you are doing them properly. They do have specific requirements. There are a number of procedures that require those. Here is a list, it's actually from I-Corps, of all the procedures that require an interpretation report. Within I-Corps, you can simply click on one of these and it'll go right into the report for that procedure. Here's the basic layout. We're going to be covering that in a few minutes within I-Corps. One final thing before we get into I-Corps. One of the things that we see, many doctors just are totally unaware of the requirement on the interpretation report. They don't realize they're required, or they don't realize what the components of the interpretation report are. As a result, that they're getting hit with audits. It's not simple. All payers, all states are enforcing this. They know that most doctors aren't doing them properly. If you're only doing, what did you do, what did you see, you are not compliant to our interpretation report. You will lose an audit or request for records. One of the things that we find in terms of what's going on that is that the average hit penalty for not doing an interpretation report is between $40,000 and $60,000. That's a lot of money. We have seen cases where doctors are getting hit with substantially more, well over $100,000. So please make sure you're doing them properly. The other thing is you have to make sure it's a separate report. You cannot combine reports for two different procedures on one report. You cannot have, which unfortunately many of the EHR systems do, and it gets doctors in trouble, is where you have the clinical findings in one spot under, in some cases, the title interpretation report, but you don't have the change in condition, comparative data, and you don't have clinical management. Make sure all three categories, make sure it's not two different procedures under one report. All of those things are required. We'll show you now right within I-Corps how to do all of that compliantly. So now let's talk about how I-Corps handles interpretation report. There are actually three separate ways to get into an interpretation report within I-Corps. One of them, which is I personally use most of the time, is where I can either look up a diagnosis or a procedure, and I'll go right to procedures in this case, where I can just look up a fundus photo, select it, and now we see the fundus photo screen, which we talked about in the medical coding and reimbursement section. Right here we indicate immediately that it requires an interpretation report. You simply click on it and you're into fundus photo interpretation report. In this case, we've pre-selected the patient for this exam. We've got the date of the procedure was done. Let's assume, while we're talking about dates, that you actually took this photo, let's say it was on July 3rd. So now what I-Corps does for you, it allows you to record the date the procedure was performed, as well as what date the procedure interpretation report were finalized. So you can have those two dates. It keeps you compliant. So now I have in here, and I'll just do on the findings. I've already talked about how a lot of articles talk about clinical findings. What did you do? What did you see? Well, the other two parts of an interpretation report that are required is comparative data change and condition. This is where you are recording for the diagnosis code that you perform this procedure, in this case fundus photo, is the patient's condition better, worse, or stable? And then the other category, the third category, is clinical management. Again, for the diagnosis code that you perform this procedure, how are you managing this patient? Now, any of this information does not have to be wordy. It can be very concise, etc. What we've done in iCor to make it very simple for you and very fast, very efficient, is where I can simply click on the pre-written text. This is specific for fundus photo and only for that category clinical findings. So you're not weeding through a lot of text for other procedures, other categories, etc. Strictly fundus photo, strictly clinical findings. Let's look at the way our interpretation report for the clinical findings is organized. Here are all the things for everything normal. So when everything's normal, I can simply click here. Here are the abnormal findings. First, in the optic nerve, macula, nerve fiber layer, and on the next page, all the other retinal issues. In addition, you can change the wording on each of these lines. You can delete any of these lines, and through the previous screen you can actually add new text. That new text can be either for this procedure only or for all procedures. So for example, if you want something just for fundus photo clinical finding, it would be specific to be added to this. If you wanted a new referring physician, then you could add it for all procedures under management, referred to Dr. Jones, etc. And you can add that, and it's automatically going to be in there for every procedure. So let's take a look at this one. In this case, I'm going to say, first of all, it's a reliable study. And the macula is normal. And I've seen this and this in the right eye, this in the left, and I'm done. And you can see the recording here. It is always recorded in right eye, left eye, and then both eye order. So you'll always see it in that order. On the change of condition and comparative data, again, the pre-written text has got everything you typically will need. If this is the first time you have performed a fundus photo on this patient, you have nothing to compare it to. So you can simply say initial and you're done. One of the things you have to be very careful about on any of the categories, and it actually applies to just about everything in exam documentation, if there's nothing to report, in other words, it's initial, you cannot leave it blank. You must have something there. So if I had this report done and I left the comparative data blank, you would lose an interpretation report audit. You'd have to give all the reimbursement back for the procedure plus interest plus penalty. We're going to take the assumption that it's not initial, it's subsequent. Increased cupping of the optic nerve head, and I'm done. And then finally, I'd like to see this patient back in 3 months. I'm done. At this point, the interpretation report is complete. I've got everything I've needed. I've got my 3 categories, etc. At this point, I can save it electronically in iCor. Here's what we do in that case. We will save this report. To the day you create the report, you can go back into this report at any point that day, make any changes or anything, delete stuff, make any modifications you choose to. However, automatically on the second day, so the day after you create this report, we lock this record down. For those of you with EHR systems, you know about either finalizing or closing a record. A lot of problem happens when people don't close or finalize that record. In fact, on an EHR system, if it's not finalized or closed, many auditors will not even look at it because it's open. You can make any changes. There's no audit trail. That's why with interpretation report, we automatically lock this down for you. If you have a change after the day that you create this record, we provide you with an addendum. You can go in, type what you want, save it. We automatically lock down the addendum note and date and time stamp it. It's exactly what the auditors want. So I, again, save that within iCor. Most of our users actually retain the interpretation report in iCor. There is no regulation that it has to be with the exam documentation, whether paper or electronic. Moving over here for print. Print actually performs two different functions. One, it will print it out on paper. So for those of you with paper records, if you want to print it out, you can print it and include it in your paper record along with the actual imaging if you print that out also. Another function within the print menu is, depending on the EHR system, you can actually print it, and we will have it for your EHR system specifically, where it produces a file that is automatically sent to where your EHR system wants to import it in. So remember the process that your EHR system has, where you can print something or have something sent to you in the mail that's printed. You can then scan it and bring it into your EHR system. What we do in iCor is we skip all that extra stuff. You don't have to print it and scan it. We automatically will send it right to your EHR system where it can be imported right into the patient record. So that's the quickest way to do an interpretation and report. Now I'm going to show you another way to do interpretation and report. I'm back at the main menu. I'm going to select interpretation and report, and I can actually go through here. And I'm going to start with, this is a screen where you saw it before, where it's showing you all the procedures that require an interpretation report. I'm going to select an optic nerve scan. So now I'm in the interpretation report, just like the fundus. At this point, I'm going to go through, select the stuff without going through a lot of explanation, so you can actually see how very fast this is to collect. It's a reliable study. I've seen everything normal on the optic nerve head. I have a problem here and here. I'm done. Change of condition, comparative data, it's subsequent. Nerve fiber loss is worsening. I'm done. And then finally, I want to see this patient back in 3 months. I am done. My report is complete. Just a matter of seconds. I'm going to wrap this section up, but before we finish, I want you, more importantly, to walk away from this not as much with whether or not you purchase iCor or use iCor to do your interpretation report, but that you're doing them properly. We see through our consulting with NT Practice consultants, so many practices get hit for non-compliant exams. Many practices getting hit simply because their interpretation reports aren't compliant, they're not complete. If you are doing your reports now, whether it's through paper or through an EHR system, and essentially all you're doing is reporting on what you did, what you saw, you do not have a compliant report. If you're combining multiple procedures on one report, you do not have a compliant report. You must remember that you have to have all three categories of those things, and go back to that interpretation report. And that is clinical findings. What did you do? What did you see? Comparative data, change in condition. Is the patient's condition better, worse, or stable? And finally, what are you doing to manage that patient? In all the examples I use, there's not a lot of explanation there, but it's sufficient. You don't have to have a lot of verbiage. But again, most doctors, 80% of you, are not doing compliant interpretation reports. We see it all the time. People talk to us about this, and then we find out when we're auditing them, or if they get hit with an audit, that they're not even close to being compliant. Please make sure you're doing it properly. And we'll thank you for your attention.